What's the most messed up thing you've ever walked in on? Story 1. A walking-in story from a party I was at when we were all about 18 or 19. A couple of hours in, everyone had turned up, except one of the birthday girl's best friends. She eventually calls and says she's out at a club and asks if she can bring the guy she's met, whose name is apparently Sketch. Half an hour later, they turned up, pretty drunk. And after about 15 minutes, we realized they had vanished upstairs. Birthday girl doesn't really want them fooling around in her bedroom, but no one wants to walk in on them either. So we send the drunkest guy up to call them down. He toddles off upstairs and then, about a minute later, comes back into the living room, looking pale and distraught. He sits down. We ask what happened. He said with his shivering voice, "I went up and opened the door, and he was savoring her pie, and then he looked over at me, and I think he was a vampire. There was blood all over his mouth. So I left." Turned out they'd started fooling around. It became clear it was her time of the month. But Sketch decided to power on through. We'd accidentally sent up the one person who in a drunken haze was not mentally equipped to deal with this at all. He looked broken for the rest of the night. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button, and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I went bar hopping with some friends a while ago, and one of the girls in the group had a habit of running off when she got drunk and getting into trouble. As soon as we realized she was gone, everyone split up to look for her. I went to check the restrooms. The bar that we were in had one restroom for both guys and girls, but multiple stalls. I find a stall with the door slightly open and hear weird noises from inside. Figured she must be puking in there, so I barge in. It wasn't her. It was actually three guys in a pseudo-human centipede three-way. I can tell you the logistics of three grown men clapping cheeks in a stall, seeing as I barely understand it myself. I backed out slowly, had a cigarette, and called it a night. We found my friend later that night, eating fries and making friends with strangers. We invite that friend out every once in a while because she's good fun and because her sister comes along to wrangle her in when she bolts. Story 3. A couple of years ago, I went to my grandparents' house because I needed some stuff that I was sure my grandpa had in his garage. I was greeted by Grandma, who told me Grandpa was out back doing some work. All good so far. I headed to the garage in the backyard, opened the door and started with, "Hey Grandpa, do you remember that stat? Oh no, oh no no no." Grandpa was furiously soloing off to some vintage VHS 80s corn on a janky old CRT TV. I noped the heck out of there, but I'm sure he saw me. I saw him. We saw each other. My brain just froze. I had no idea how to process that moment, so I just walked back home. We live very close to each other, since it was a small town. When I got home, I found my brother, looked him straight in the eyes, and said, "Dude, I just saw Grandpa petting his dong to some vintage corn in the garage." There was a brief moment of silence, and then we laughed our butts off for 5 minutes straight, tears running down our faces. Grandpa was 90 at the time, and honestly, if at that age you still have the willpower to play the old meat flute, good for you. You go, Grandpa. We never talked about that incident again. Grandpa never said a word, but boy oh boy, the next family reunion was so awkward. Story 4. I had this experience twice. The first was around 2000. I went for a job interview, and apparently no one told the guy who was supposed to be interviewing me that I was to be interviewed. So, some of the guys from the company pointed me to his trailer, and my idiot self, being 19, just tapped on the door twice and walked in. Well, this big nasty guy had his legs kicked up, watching corn loud enough. I could tell what was going on. Thankfully, I had the wrong angle on him to see anything. Needless to say, I apologized and walked straight out of there. Screw that job. The second time, I got hired as a deckhand for a tugboat. This happened only about 6 months later, I think. Anyway, I walked on said tugboat, and the first thing you see when you go in is the gallery. Well, I saw some pots with some baking soda on the side of them, and smelled that smell, if you know what I mean. I did some powder a few times by then, and I knew what was up when I walked in. The captain and the mate were cooking crack on the boat. So, I called the company and told them I appreciate the offer, but I won't be working for them. Not going hundreds of miles offshore with crackheads driving me around. No thanks. Story 5. It was quite a few years ago now, 15, maybe even more. I was at a pretty low-key house party, nothing wild. There were maybe 6 of us, tops. It was meant to be a chill evening, just a few people hanging out, drinking casually and enjoying each other's company. One guy showed up and got very, very drunk, fast. Before long, he was getting confrontational and rude to some of the others, so we told him to go into another room and calm down. About 30 minutes later, we checked on him and found him fast asleep. We thought, all right, he's out cold, let's just leave him be, and went back to enjoying the night. It was at a friend's house whose much younger sister was out with her parents somewhere else. A few hours later, a couple of the guys and I got hungry and decided to walk into town to a Subway that was open until the early hours. The round trip probably took us about an hour, but it was totally worth it for the food. As we left, others started heading out too. The party host went to bed with his girlfriend, and the drunk guy was still out cold, sitting upright in a chair in the front room. We had a key so we could let ourselves back in whenever we returned. When we got back, all the lights were off. Clear signs everyone was either asleep or had gone home. We crept inside and flicked on the front room light, only to find the formerly passed-out drunk guy still out cold, but now lying face down on the floor, his pants around his ankles, with a Barbie doll shoved head first where it definitely shouldn't have been. We saw it, quickly switched the light off, and quietly backed out of the room, leaving him exactly as he was. This was back when camera phones were still brand new and expensive, so snapping a picture wasn't really an option. But if that had happened now, oh, it definitely would have been recorded. We all went to sleep, scattered around different rooms in the house. The next morning, we woke up to find the drunk guy was gone and his mess-covered Barbie doll left behind in the front room. Our host cleaned it up, tossed out the remains, and after that, we never really talked about it again. For what it's worth, when we left, he was the only one in the room. So, unless the guy and his girlfriend, the ones who hosted the party, did it, and judging by the look on his face during cleanup the next day, it definitely wasn't them. It seemed like he had done it to himself. The rest of the house was locked up, and no one else was inside. Story 6. I have a friend who had an apartment in college with 2 other people, a guy and a girl. The girl was not paying her rent and had a pet bunny that she didn't take care of. My friend spent all of his time either in his room or out of the house because being around the other 2 was toxic and uncomfortable, as they would always fight about this. Well, things boiled over between the 2 of them, and the guy told my friend jokingly that he was going to off her bunny if she didn't pay rent. My friend and I were out and about at the time, but when we got back to his place, we found that he really did off the bunny in the very disturbing way imaginable. He had the most sickening grin on his face the whole time. After he drained it, he cooked it, ate it, and left the bones out on the table for the girl to find when she got home. Karma caught up with him quickly, though. He ended up hitting and offing a pedestrian with his car and fleeing the scene. They caught him on camera, and he is in prison now. Story 7. I had a late school assignment, and I came into class after school hours to talk to the teacher unannounced. I caught him looking at video footage on his computer from a webcam he had installed under his desk that showed the front of the classroom. He tried to tell me that he was confused about how it worked and needed to adjust it better. I told the school administrators, and he was never seen or heard from again. The following day, his stuff was cleaned out of the classroom, and we had a temporary teacher for the rest of the year. I wonder if I had not walked in on that, how that could have escalated to worsening abuses. Story 8. I was in the military, living in the dorms, and my buddy and I were planning to play Final Fantasy XI and Halo after work. He was going to be late, so I drove to Taco Bell to get dinner for us both. Since I knew what he wanted, 2 grilled stuffed burritos and an orange soda, always the same order. Anyway, I get home, drop his food off, and eat by myself in my room. I called him to see if I could swing by, because I left my wallet on his desk, and he said, "Yeah, just give me a second, and come on in, I'm changing." Cool. I waited 5 minutes, went over, let myself in, and saw my buddy with his dong deep in his frigging burrito. I quietly backed out of the room before he could notice me, shut the door, and never spoke of it. I got my wallet an hour or so later, and we played games online but never brought it up. Strangest thing I've ever seen, but hey, I guess he had to do what he had to do. Story 9. I once walked in on my dad, 35, and his girlfriend, 20, while they were in bed. She was laughing uncontrollably and grinning from ear to ear, but as soon as she noticed me, she started calling out for help. Not in fear, but in a playful, dramatic way, like, "Help me. I can't take it." It turns out my dad was tickling her, and she was clearly overwhelmed by it. I was like 12 and fully aware, and had walked up to the bead door they had on their room, just to ask a question. The beads meant I couldn't have even knocked and prevented myself from accidentally witnessing it. I'm not one of those "my parents bang each other, ew" types. But when you walk in and the woman your dad is banging starts yelling out to you by name, it's upsetting. It was a horrible experience. Story 10. So, this happened when I was in secondary school. We were both in year 9. I was hanging out with another mutual friend at the time, and we decided to head over to this guy's house and see if he wanted to hang out. So, we head over, knock on the door, and his mom lets me in and says that he is upstairs. I head in alone and go upstairs. I checked his room, and he's not there, so I head over to his brother's room. I open the door, and I was floored. His brother is lying on his back, and my friend was working on his meat flute. He turned around and looked at me, and I was frozen like a deer in freaking headlights. His brother jumped up and ran past me to the bathroom. I quickly left the house. I explained everything to my friend outside, and we both walked off in silence. The other guy then told everyone at school about it, and the jerk blamed me. "Maybe you shouldn't screw your own brother, then, mate." We stopped hanging out after that. Story 11. Didn't really walk in on it, as it kind of just started happening right in front of us. I was at this party chatting with my girlfriend and her friend near the edge of the room, facing a couch. Out of nowhere, this guy dressed as Superman kneels down in front of another dude sitting there and starts giving him a blowy. No warning, no lead up, just full on in the middle of the party. A few moments later, it seems like the guy was done, and suddenly Superman starts coughing hard. Then he hacks up a rubber right onto the floor. Without missing a beat, he stands up, wipes his mouth, and just walks away like nothing happened, like it was the most normal thing in the world. We looked at ourselves and couldn't believe what had just happened right in front of us, and the fact that no one else at the party seemed fazed by it. Story 12. When I was 14, I had a sleepover at my neighbor's. I woke up early and was not feeling well, so I went home. I heard some noises coming from my parents' bedroom, and I walked in on them banging on the staircase. I turned around and went back to my friend's house without saying a word. My parents never noticed, and now that I am older, I find it great that they keep their love life spicy. However, there are some things you cannot unsee. Story 13. This remains the most screwed up thing I've ever seen in person. I went out with my friend and her boyfriend and went back to their place to stay the night. We all went to bed. So, in the middle of the night, I left the guest room to go to the bathroom and walked in on my friend over on the kitchen floor and her dog banging on her. Her boyfriend was flat on his back watching up close. I backed away slowly into the bedroom and waited for a very long time to try to go to the bathroom again. Then I left very early in the morning and never talked to them again because it would have been too uncomfortable for me. Story 14. My pregnant wife had a diabetic seizure in our bed after I got home from work. I can honestly say I never knew fear before this. It was a typical day. I went to work early in the morning. At the time, I was working for a call center we referred to as Hell Et during this time. My wife was about 7 months pregnant with our daughter Zelda. She had many dips and highs with her blood sugar because of the pregnancy. So, I always made sure she had her medical supplies and snacks as well, just in case. After a long day of hearing about people complaining about their butterfingers and processing a couple of hundred emails, I finally get off the clock and head to our little rinky-dink apartment near the downtown Wilkes-Barre Square. As I walked towards our door, I heard my wife screaming incoherently in pain. I, for a brief moment, froze up thinking she may have gone into labor. I immediately unlocked the door and ran in. To my absolute terror, my wife was lying in our bed, flinging her arms and legs about violently while foaming at the mouth. She had taken a nap, and during that time her blood sugar had dropped into the low 20s. There are 2 types of diabetic seizures, the simple shaking kind and the super violent kind. This way, the first time I experienced one of her violent ones, and being that it also was jeopardizing our kid, it only amplified my terror. I quickly calmed myself and immediately ran for a glucagon shot. After a brief moment, I stabbed her in the thigh and immediately fought to massage the area so it would spread quickly. After another 2 or so minutes of her uncontrollably shaking, she finally came back out of it. She and the baby were fine, and now our little girl is 4 and healthy as an ox. Needless to say, that moment was the scariest moment of my life, and I have been in a lot of scary situations, from car wrecks to skydiving, but nothing scared me more or freaked me out more than that moment. Also, since I'm horribly terrified of needles. Story 15. I was a flight paramedic at the time. The helicopter was down for maintenance, so I jumped on a unit at 3 a.m. to respond to an abdominal pain emergency with that unit's crew. Arrived to find a late 50s man sitting on the bathroom floor in his tighty-whities. Except they were no longer white. There is both fresh and dried blood all over him, the floor and the side of the bathtub. It looked like a murder scene. We honestly thought he'd been shot. This dude's skin was pale but totally awake and alert, no longer complaining of pain. He stated his abdominal pain had been severe, but intermittent since midnight, and he began throwing up blood shortly thereafter. As he's talking to us, he suddenly stops, gets this blank stare in his eyes, opens his mouth, and huge clots of blood just start pouring out. No retching or heaving whatsoever. Freakiest thing I've ever seen. About 20 seconds later, he zones back in and begins talking like nothing ever happened. We did what we needed to do and got him to the ER quickly. I described what happened at the scene to the ER MD. The doctor and I went into the patient's room. As the doctor was doing his assessment, the patient was talking and gets that blank stare again, and goes through another round of nasty blood clot emesis, just like before. The doctor turns to me and says, "Well, I've never seen anything like that before, and I've seen a lot. I still get a little freaked thinking about it. And it happened over 15 years ago." Story 16. I walked into my webpage design class as a sophomore in high school to find the agriculture teacher finger-banging my teacher. I was making up a test from the previous week after school, and I guess she forgot I was coming. I walked in just in time to see the male teacher whipping his hand out from her dress and her spinning around in the chair. They were both talking over each other, scrambling to explain that what I saw wasn't actually what I thought it was. I didn't argue, I just went along with it. Honestly, I was too intimidated to push back, especially since one of them was my agriculture teacher that year. He left without so much as a goodbye, and I sat there taking my test. I felt awful, guilty, even. I wished I had said something. They were both married, and one of them was married to another teacher at the school. Story 17. I walked into an unlocked bathroom stall only to find a completely unclothed fat black kid, around 10 + 12 years old, standing on the rim of the toilet while squatting to take a poo. He immediately began screaming profanities at me, as if I were the dumb guy who was literally unclothed in a public toilet and forgot to lock the door. I've tried, but it can't be unseen. Story 18. I walked in on a guy being attacked in the neck at work. An artery popped, and my 3 coworkers and I kept him alive until the ambulance showed up. At the same time, I had to close down the restaurant, get people out, and the other coworkers who were not managers, away from the scene and up to the dressing rooms, also cussing at people outside of the restaurant, flipping their phones up, and filming or taking photos. I was 19 at the time. Pretty horrible experience overall. The guy survived. Apparently, he got attacked because he owed the stabber some money. The restaurant is a McDonald's in Sweden. The other 3 coworkers did the most directly with the victim, keeping him alive by pinching the artery or whatever it was to try and keep the blood flow restrained. I spotted him and did my part with the other coworkers and guests in the restaurant, and so on. It was hectic and chaotic as a whole and awful. At the moment, everything just went autopilot from what I recall. Watching the security footage afterwards, I had actually forgotten the things I did and how I acted during this. Story 19. My ex was high on air duster, mumbling to herself while she was semi-conscious on the carpet. Her arm was bent backwards while her hand was in the back of her pants. I confronted her, she mumbled, and I then realized she had crapped herself and was smearing it on the floor. She asked me if I wanted to marry her right then. Story 20. My wife and I were out hiking, exploring old caves. I'd read about one with a narrow entrance that supposedly opened into a massive chamber inside. Naturally, I wanted to check it out. Pretty sure I picked the wrong cave. I started crawling in tight space, pitch black. I flicked on my flashlight to get my bearings and aimed it upward. The ceiling was alive. Thousands of spiders, writhing, pulsing, packed so densely it looked like the rock itself was moving. I screamed like a kid and yelled for my wife to pull me out. She grabbed my feet and yanked me back fast. The image of that ceiling still messes with me. It wasn't just covered in spiders, it was spiders. This was outside the SF Bay Area, like 1.5 hours. I can't remember what the area was called exactly. We did a lot of hiking and rock climbing when we lived in CA. We saw some people post about cool caves in areas we wanted to go to anyway, and thought we would give it a shot. Don't give it a shot. Never again. Story 21. I used to work at a grocery store when I was 16 to 18 years old and spent most of that time as a bagger. We had several employees with special needs, and they were all wonderful, but one in particular liked to get himself into trouble. Let's call him Adam. Adam had become quite skilled at disappearing to the bathroom during his shifts, sometimes spending up to 2 hours at a time in there. Usually, our managers would have his job coach track him down and bring him back, but at this particular moment, the job coach was occupied elsewhere. So, I was asked to go get Adam from the restroom. What I walked in on was nothing short of astonishing. Not only had he been hanging out in there for hours, but he had also found a rather unexpected way to pass the time. He was completely unclothed, lying on the floor with his clothes folded neatly beside him, and was pulling his taffy. The creepiest part? We had pictures of employees who were about to graduate from high school or college posted around, and Adam had taken a few of those pictures with him into the bathroom. Story 22. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. The world outside was pitch black. I had woken up, thirsty, and wandered into the kitchen for a drink. As I passed the window, I noticed my grandmother, who had been staying with us for a few days, standing outside, her back to me, a cigarette glowing faintly in her hand. I didn't think much of it and continued on to the kitchen. After finishing a glass of water, I turned to head back to bed, only to find her stepping inside. Blood was dripping from her head. Her coat was soaked in it. She looked like something out of a horror film, like a serial killer walking in from the night. I was terrified. My heart jumped into my throat, and I nearly screamed. But before I could say anything, she looked at me calmly and asked, "What's wrong, dear?" She didn't even realize she was hurt. She explained that she had stumbled and fallen to the ground, but insisted she was fine and told me not to wake my parents. Said she didn't want to bother anyone. Still in shock, I stepped outside to where she had been, and there it was. A dark, glistening pool of blood on the concrete. We took her straight to the doctor after that. Honestly, seeing her like that, bleeding, dazed, and unaware, almost made me crap my pants. Story 23. I was babysitting 2 boys, aged 8 and 10. I heard them giggling in the bathroom, so I opened the door to check. The 8-year-old was sitting on the toilet, bent over, while the 10-year-old stood behind him holding a paper plate, and the 8-year-old was pooping onto it. I shouted, "What the heck are you doing?" The 10-year-old stepped back, wide-eyed and frozen like a deer in headlights, clutching the paper plate with the poop on it. Meanwhile, the 8-year-old nervously piped up, trying to throw his older brother under the bus. He started panicking and stammering. It was an accident. I didn't know what he was doing. He just told me to bend over. Story 24. I was 15. Working at a place that sold drywall, metal studs, and all the related materials. I was out in the yard moving bundles of metal studs when I suddenly heard a scream. I spun around and saw the forklift driver in absolute panic. His left hand was cut off at the wrist, hanging backwards, barely attached by a thin flap of skin or something. He had been helping another guy load a huge bundle of metal studs onto the forklift. Unlike the rest of us, he wasn't wearing the giant Kelly work gloves we had. Gloves that came almost up to our elbows. The edges of those studs were razor sharp. The bundle was wet, and when he grabbed it and pulled hard, it slipped from his grip. That 200-plus-pound mass of sharp metal slammed into his wrist and took off about 90% of his hand. I'd stepped like to say my first aid training kicked in, and I calmly handled the situation, but I was only 15. Instead, I ran screaming into the shop, yelling, "John cut his freaking hand off. John cut his freaking hand off." I did end up going back outside to help before the ambulance arrived. Later, my manager sat me down in his office and handed me 2 fingers of some terrible whiskey while I sat there with blood splattered on my jeans, boots, and gloves. Things were definitely different back in the 1980s. Booze was still somehow considered a valid HR counseling method. Amazingly, the cut was very precise, and surgeons reattached it, and he got about 90% of full strength and used it. I saw him several years later, and he was a fireman responding to a brush fire near our house. We had gone out with some Gatorade, water, beer, and sandwiches for the crew, and when he saw me, he recognized me immediately. He laughed, raised his left hand high, and shouted good-naturedly, "John cut his freaking hand off," waggling his arm at me with a big grin. Good times. Story 25. I used to have roommates. One was a behemoth of a feminist woman who worked at a gay bar. The other was a super chill and really cool gay guy. One day I came home from work, opened the door, and no more than 10 feet in front of me I caught my gay roommate, 6 feet tall and very thin, getting plowed by his huge boyfriend, who was just under 6 feet, but easily 300 pounds. Definitely not what I was expecting to walk into. Another time, I came home to find my large feminist roommate throwing a party. I headed into my bedroom to play some video games, and there were 2 guys banging in my bed. She'd nagged me about leaving a plate in the sink, yet she let strangers use my room like that? She was a truly terrible, two-faced jerk in every sense of the word. Story 26. I didn't walk in on this, but it's screwed up. I work in an emergency department, doing patient registration, the guy you talk to when you check in, and updating the guy you talk to about your insurance/copay/etc. On this night, I was doing the latter. Also, when a person comes in as a result of a trauma via ambulance or helicopter, we rarely know what they're there for. Most often, it's a car accident or an accident at home. Usually, the injuries are graphic, but rarely fatal. When the updater goes to talk to them, we recover all of the accident info. When a person comes in as a trauma, they don't sign the consent form they would at registration. It's part of the updater's responsibility to get consent when they do the update. On this night, I have a trauma patient in the pediatric side of the emergency department. Since it's a trauma registration, I don't know what they're there for, so I just assume a car accident injury, since it's the most common. I went to get the update from the father, who steps out of the room to speak to me. The father has been noticeably crying, so I elected to go the speed route and skip the unnecessary questions, getting the basics, insurance, and consent. I'm experienced, so I fly through this as fast as I can on a healthcare keyboard, which we call rubber keyboards because they're covered and rubber and are impossible to type on. I get to the end and go to ask for the consent. "Would you mind just signing something for me real fast? This is just consent for your daughter to be seen by the doctor and be treated." At this point, he looks at me with deer-in-headlights eyes and tells me his daughter is dead. His 10-year-old daughter had offed herself. I apologized profusely, offered my ever-so-useful condolences, and excused myself as fast as I could. At this juncture, I had about 30 minutes left in my shift. I did nothing for those 30 minutes. It's the worst thing I've ever experienced. Story 27. I was around 15 years old and had to use the bathroom. I went to this unisex single-occupancy bathroom, and when I opened the door, an Indian lady was peeing standing up while holding her skirt up. She didn't even act startled or anything. She just turned and smiled at me, and I quickly closed the door. I turned gay, by the way. Story 28. About 2 weeks ago, I was driving around a storage building for work when I noticed a car parked tight against the side of the building. I saw a foot resting on the driver's seat headrest and chuckled, thinking someone was just taking a nice nap. But as the back seat came into view, I realized the woman wasn't sleeping. She was being enthusiastically eaten out by a man sporting a horseshoe haircut. The loud roar of my truck pulling up and parking right behind them didn't slow them down one bit. Even the sound of our doors closing didn't faze them. I still get flashbacks of the woman's contorted facial expression, definitely disturbed for the rest of the week. Story 29. So to start, I am deaf, hard of hearing. That's important to keep in mind. About 5 or 6 years ago, my mom was in the hospital. She'd been there for weeks after recently having surgery for cancer. She shared a room with another woman. This other woman was pretty loud and demanding, so much so that even I could hear her shouting sometimes. One day, I was there sitting in my chair, playing Bejeweled on my phone. The woman's son and daughter were near her bed, and I kept glancing over because they were kind of shouting at her and crying. I figured maybe they were having an argument or something, so I shrugged it off and kept playing. About 15 minutes later, my mom asked me to help her move because she wanted to get out of the room. I grudgingly helped my mom move, even though she was in no condition to be moved at all. Once we were outside the room, she looked at me with concern and told me that the woman had just died. She said it was better for us to be outside, so the family could say their final goodbyes. And I was like, what the heck? Someone had died just a couple of meters away from me, and I was playing on my phone, completely oblivious. Not a single nurse or doctor was called out or anything. I didn't notice a thing. I know I'm deaf and a bit absent-minded, but seriously, come on. I asked my mom about it, and she calmly explained that the doctors had told the woman's family earlier that morning she was going to die either that day or the next. My mom had worked in a hospital for over 35 years, so she was experienced with situations like this. She hadn't told me beforehand because she didn't want to make me anxious. Plus, with bed and room shortages, we couldn't move to another room. There was nothing to do but wait for the woman to pass. Right then, I started crying, almost hysterical. I think I was overwhelmed by thoughts of my mom's illness and how suddenly everything had happened. I don't know exactly, but I think I was in shock. We walked around for a bit, even though my mom really shouldn't have been out of bed. She was very ill herself. About 2 hours later, we came back, and the bed was clean. The woman and her family were gone. A few hours after that, a new lady took the same bed, everything thoroughly cleaned beforehand, and that was it. Some months later, my mom passed away, and at least then we were alone with her, no strangers in the room playing on their phones. It still feels really strange when I think about that day, and kind of sad too. Story 30. This happened years ago in a city far, far away. I was working late at my IT job in San Francisco. As I entered the city center BART station, someone came running up to the ticket agent at the turnstiles, yelling that his friend was hurt and needed medical help. The agent and I rushed up the stairs that led down all the way to the BART platform. Looking down, I saw a man sprawled on the stone floor at the platform level, with a pool of blood around his head. I went down the steps and started administering first aid as best as I could, even though my skills were limited. The ticket agent called for police and EMS. There was a doctor up on the Muni level giving helpful instructions over the phone, but he wouldn't come down to help. The stairway had a wall with a handrail, about 5 feet tall. This intoxicated person had been walking on top of that wall, then fell off, landing hard on the stone floor of the BART station. He'd fractured his skull and was bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth. Kept him immobilized and conscious until the police and EMS arrived. A freelance camera crew showed up long before the police or EMS did. At the time, I thought that was the most messed up part of the whole situation. But a couple of months later, I got contacted by a lawyer for BART who wanted to depose me to get my side of the story. It turned out that yes, the intoxicated guy had been walking along the top of the wall, but one of his so-called buddies had actually pushed him off, causing the fall. And now the intoxicated guy was suing BART. Story 31. When we were 16, a friend threw a party while his parents were out of town. Nobody really knew when to stop drinking at that age. Around 2 a.m., we realized he'd gone missing. After searching the house, we found him passed out in the downstairs toilet, trousers around his ankles and completely out cold mid-poo. There was a small problem. He'd left his boxer shorts on. It's honestly surprising how far a drunk, passed-out kid can spread his mess around a tiny bathroom. There was shit all over himself. The toilet, the walls, and the floor. Like any responsible kids would do, we just left him there, carried on with the party for a bit longer, and then finally went to bed. I decided to crash in his bed and was woken up around 5 a.m. by him trying to crawl into bed with me, covered in even more of his mess. If it weren't for the smell, you might have thought he was smothered in Nutella. Story 32. I was working for a Meals on Wheels transportation service in a very rural area. One day, the snow was coming down heavily, and I was running about an hour behind schedule. After finishing the meal deliveries, I started on medical appointment pickups. Pulling up to the first client, a frail elderly man, the snow was falling fast and thick. I backed the vehicle in, got out, and noticed a suspicious snowy pile beside my car. Something didn't feel right. I cleared some snow away and spotted a foot. Panicked, I frantically dug through the snow, fearing the man had fallen and couldn't get back up. As I cleared more snow, a lot of blood began to appear around him. I uncovered his head, or what was left of it, and then cleared his arm to check for a pulse. That's when I saw the gun. He had shot himself right there in his driveway, trying not to make a mess in his house for his kids. He had scheduled an appointment he never actually had, so that I would find him. But with the storm raging, the situation was much worse than he might have planned. Honestly, it was traumatizing. I don't remember much from that day except those moments. I do recall needing to be driven home afterward. The man was a regular, a veteran of the Navy, because he wore a hat with a ship's name on it whenever I saw him. Story 33. About 4 years ago, when I was 25, I got home around 7 p.m. after a long day at work. I was renting a room in a trailer at a trailer park. The trailer had 2 bedrooms, one for me and the other for the landlord who also lived there. She had made it very clear that her son was not supposed to be around. Normally, I kept to myself and avoided interacting with anyone. On the rare occasions when her son was home, I just ignore him and go about my business. He was 27, unemployed, mostly by choice, as I saw it, and constantly complained about not being able to find work because he had no transportation. He had a habit of stealing from his mother. Here are just a few things he did. He stole her gun from a drawer and left a note saying he just wanted to show it off to his friends. He sold her lawnmower for cash and also took some of her jewelry. He snuck in through the back window while we were at work and raided the fridge. He brought over sketchy friends, including one who had a warrant out for his arrest. Anyway, on this particular day, I got home and noticed he was there with 2 friends. As I passed the computer room on my way to my bedroom, he called out to me, telling me to check out some girls on Facebook. I just shrugged and replied, "I don't really care, man." Then one of his friends decided to show off his gun. He said he had found it earlier that week and claimed it didn't work. To prove his point, he pointed it at the wall and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened, even with the safety off. He casually swung the gun around as he explained he'd been taking it apart and cleaning it, trying to get it to work. Watching that made me uncomfortable, so I decided to hurry up, take a shower, and head to Starbucks while I still had time before they closed. I had just gotten out of the shower and was in my boxers, getting ready to hop on my bike, when I suddenly heard a loud, sharp bang. I'd never heard a gunshot up close before, so I wasn't even sure that's what it was. I opened my door and half-jokingly asked, "Did one of you guys shoot yourselves?" That's when the roommate's son and his friend came running out of the room, panicked and yelling, "He didn't do it on purpose." I quickly threw on some pants and a t-shirt, opened the door again, and saw smoke billowing out. I could also hear someone gargling and something thudding repeatedly against the futon frame. That short walk down the hallway felt like the longest walk of my life. As I got closer to the computer room, the smell of burnt flesh hit me. I'm not exactly sure how to describe the scent of a gunshot, but that's the closest I can come. When I stepped inside, I saw one of the guys lying on the floor, convulsing and bleeding heavily from his neck and mouth. He'd accidentally shot himself in the neck while looking down the barrel of the gun, assuming it still wouldn't fire like before. We called 911. They instructed me to stay with him, try to stop the bleeding, and monitor his pulse. Meanwhile, his friends were freaking out, running in and out of the room. I told one to call the police and the other to notify his family, mainly to keep them busy, because they were absolutely useless. They refused to help with the bleeding or even hand me towels. The guy who hurt himself was huge, and it took every ounce of my strength to keep him still as his body shook violently. Blood was everywhere on me, on the floor, as I fought to keep him alive. Meanwhile, his friends were practically running around in circles outside, completely useless. Thankfully, he survived. Everything turned out okay in the end. But my plans for Starbucks were dashed. The place became a crime scene, and my bike was off limits, taped off by the police. Later that night, my roommate came home from work, and I explained everything, the situation with her son, and what his friends had been doing. The next morning, I almost forgot about it, until I walked past the computer room. Blood was still splattered across the carpet, walls, and futon, so I cleaned it up. It was a weird and disturbing experience, and I dealt with some PTSD for a while afterward. But one thing I took away from it was how valuable critical thinking can be in chaotic moments, and how thankful I am that I had enough of it to act when it mattered most. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.